today, man. I really appreciate it. You were a guy who I saw I instantly wanted to pick the brain of just because I'm starting to venture out a little bit in terms of the type of content I'm putting on my channel.
Okay.
And I've originally, I don't know if you did any background research or anything, but most of my content is usually talking to athletes about their experiences. So, and I majored in psychology, so I wanted to really venture out and see if I could find anybody that could really kind of, I could talk about that too, because, that's a huge aspect of not only athletics, but life. So,
Yeah.
um, and you seem to be a great person to talk to. So I appreciate you coming on today, man.
Yeah.
How are you
Thanks for
doing?
having me.
Alrighty. Yeah, so I mean, Pat, just tell me a little bit about yourself, man, and kind of what you do in your, I guess, your role in the mental health industry. I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been a mental health licensed professional counselor. So everybody in the mental health space every state's a little bit licensed a little bit differently. There's a majority of the states have something similar to what is like a licensed professional counselor. So been LPC for about 10 years. Started out as a psychologist, so a little bit different licensure, kind of a little bit different role. But we all kind of generally do the same thing. And then switched my license in 2019, and so I've been kind of working in the outpatient setting for most of my career. Throughout the 10 years, in 4 of those years, I was specialized in sexual addiction, so I kind of worked within a program, still outpatient, but basically with an inpatient model, essentially of helping people overcome sexual addiction, pornography, multiple affairs, those kind of things are kind of our main focus. But as a specialist, that's really kind of the only majority of who you work with. So like 95% of your caseload is kind of working with that particular diagnosis or that particular issue.
Okay.
And then
Wow.
at the end of 2024, I left that clinic and or that practice, and I started my own business as a coach for mental health owners. So basically, folks who own their own practice, my goal is to try to come alongside and help them support them, whether that be from their beginning, from their vision, through their operations, through their pay structure, all the way up to their retirement. So my goal is to really try to help the owners of practices be able to improve their cultures. If you have a good culture of a practice, you're going to be able to hire the right people. You're going to hire the people who are going to be able to help serve the people that you want to serve as far as your population that you're working with and those kind of things. And there's just a lot of issues within the mental health space in regards to those ownerships and businesses because a lot of folks
Okay.
are not trained how to be business owners. And then, but I also do some contract work as well, still as an LPC. I work mostly with couples and adults. Those are kind of my main areas. And I've worked with couples throughout my career. And I've worked with all ages throughout my career. So I've kind of done a lot of different things in a lot of different areas.
Okay, so
So
you've been heavily involved for a very long time. Very long
yeah,
time.
yeah, quite a bit
Uh,
of time. Yeah. 10 years doesn't seem like 10 years, but it is. So a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
different areas I've worked in. So
That's awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you joining here today. I want to just pick your brain about a bunch of deep things. I'm got a lot of stuff
sounds
lined
good.
up here for you. The first question I kind of wanted to ask you was, I guess when people talk about mental health as in general, it's such a popular discussed thing, but not a lot of people I feel like know much about it, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, what would you say is the biggest misunderstanding that most have in regards to mental health?
Yeah, I think therapy in general, right? It's one of those
Yeah.
things where people want to come in. A lot of folks I've worked with or I've seen, they're one of their main goals when you say like, what are you hoping to get out of therapy or what's your goals to try to be here? What do you want to work on? Those kind of things. A lot of people want to go to right directly to they use the word tools.
Hmm.
And certainly there is an avenue of therapy as designed to try to give you some things to navigate some of the emotions that people have, certainly part of being human. But I think one of the things that I experience in that is that, that puts a lot of pressure on the therapist because, to one degree, I mean, there's only so many tools we have, right? We try to modify them as much as we can to fit what people need. But after a while, like there comes a point where you have to start to look at those emotions as being part of being human. And a lot of
Right.
times they very much, there's a lot of these different symptoms that really get sort of, pathologized in a way that doesn't seem to really fit what people are more focusing on the fact that that's my identity rather than necessarily that's what I deal with. And the difference there is that, my identity is that I identify with whatever my diagnosis is. I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I have bipolar, I have schizophrenia, I have narcissism, whatever, right? When really
Hmm.
some of those things are really like those are part of being human. Like narcissism, a lot of people what people are usually talking about is they're talking about selfishness, which is something we all deal with as
Right.
human beings. It's not necessarily
And
the
that's
fact that
such
we're
a
all,
commonly discussed word, right? That's just
yep.
thrown around left and right nowadays.
Yep, narcissism thrown around a lot, triggers thrown around a lot, which isn't again does not directly address what is actually what people are trying to get across. Anxiety is definitely one of those ones that gets thrown around a lot. I'm an anxious person. Well, we're all anxious people to some degree. It's a, what do we do with our anxiety is really kind of the big part of that. So yeah, I think the thing about therapy people come into is that they feel like they're going to get these things that are going to make these symptoms disappear, and it's not really quite like that. It's more of that these things are going to help you reduce the impact of them, but what do I do with them on the back end of that? Meaning, what do I do to make those things become something that I learn from, I can grow from, I can become a stronger individual with.
Right,
And
right.
those and through that talking is a lot of it, but also it's also being honest with yourself about the fact that these are things that you have to navigate, and they're not things that you necessarily can just get away from, I guess, in that way.
That's a perfect thing to touch. And I was just going to ask you kind of go down that avenue a little bit. I was going to ask kind of what, I mean, do you think that, I guess, the mental health, I guess, is it more about, would you say it's more about trying to fix what's wrong or learn about, how to better understand who you are, like understand yourself?
I think it needs to be a little bit of both. So this is
Yeah.
kind of a cop-out answer, but basically, like on one hand, I think you have to understand, okay, why these symptoms are here, and that's a little bit of background investigation. Certainly, exploring what has caused some of those things to come up for you. But on the other hand, it's understanding that these things are things that I can grow from. I've mentioned this in our podcast I've been on is this idea of how do we turn our wounds into wisdom? How do we turn the things that have been painful in our life into something that can help us become stronger? If you talk about you mentioning you talk to athletes. When you're an athlete, you got to learn how to train your body to do things, whatever that is, lift
Hmm.
more weights or to go a longer distance or to, learn your playbook if you're a football player. Like so part of it is understanding, okay, these things are going to be painful to do, but how do I become a stronger and more elite athlete because of those things? And I
Right.
really do think that there's an avenue of that comes with mental health. I mean, there's certainly things that can limit us, of course, but there's also things that can help us to become greater people because we're able to understand how to harness that power, so to speak, or harness those things that do come up, and become stronger individuals out of that.
Have you worked directly with any athletes? You kind of touched on football players just now. I was wondering if you've, gone that way with athletes at all.
Yeah, not directly, but I use a
Okay.
lot of analogies. So like a lot of times, especially when I worked with sex addiction, a majority of my guys that I worked with were guys. Most of the people I worked with were guys. Um, so I always try to use analogies that fit with men. So typically football or sports or lots of different things to try to tailor them to what people are like, what they know. For me, I always try to think about there's all kinds of tools, but if I can't be able to articulate those tools in terms that you're going to understand, then the tools are useless, right? They're not going to actually help you go anywhere.
Yeah.
So I have to
Right.
be able to find a way to word it so that you understand what that looks like. And so I'd use a lot of different analogies, and I've learned many different analogies that fit different things, how to see those in that way. So that's what I will say. It's one of the things that was really cool about working in the addiction space is I learned a lot of that stuff that I wouldn't have necessarily learned from having been without working in that space for sure. So it was a real growth opportunity for me in that way.
Okay. Wow. So, what is a belief that I guess you have had about mental health that I guess you used to have, but now from your experience has changed?
100%. I went into this job thinking that it was going to be a stable, consistent, regular kind of every 9 to 5 kind of job. That was my major misunderstanding. So I went into school thinking that I was gonna. I none of my family are in mental health. All my family are involved in some kind of creative art, to some degree. So
Okay.
I ended up in the space where like I really didn't have anybody necessarily to help me understand kind of what that looked like. And so going into it, I was expecting, okay, I'm just going to get a job and I'm going to start working just like everybody does, right? And this job is definitely not like that. It's one of those things where you have periods where you can be like that, but for the most part, it's one of those jobs where there's a lot of uncertainty in it. There's a lot of inconsistency with it. Even if you were to work in a place that has like when I just started, I worked, I used to do like 30 sessions a week, and that's about as much as I really can do without being burned out. And even though I did 30 sessions a week, I hardly made any money because I wasn't in a position where I had enough experience, enough license, wasn't a fully licensed therapist at the time. So there were some things that, certainly limited you there. But even that, like I got a ton of experience at first, but didn't see financially any kind of like stability from it. So one of the things I would say to people if they're interested in being a therapist is that know your population ahead of time as best you can that you want to work with. And what I've seen, the success I've seen people in is that they find that population and they just stay there as long as they physically can. Because if you move around a lot, that's what I did. I moved around a ton in different places. There's not a lot of these practices that necessarily have people available for you to see, and you're always rebuilding the caseload if you move a lot. And when you
Yeah.
do that, although there's some good to that, you certainly learn a lot doing that. But I would say that one of the things it's the negative side of that is that you're always starting from zero. You never move from one practice to another practice and pick up 25 people that they have available. It just doesn't work like that. In my
Right.
experience, you go from a place where you might have, let's say you have 35 people you're working with as an example, and you move over to another practice, you're not bringing a lot of those people with you if you move anywhere of any distance. And so what ends up happening is now you're going to move to a place where probably that practice, maybe they have two people, maybe they have three people that are available for you, but certainly not a whole caseload. Most cases they don't. And
Right.
even if they do necessarily, you have to build rapport with those people. And that can be kind of challenging if those people have worked with somebody else for a long time. And so this is a lot where that particular examples I give you is that's where a lot of my stuff came in with the idea of starting my own business was because that's stuff that a lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't know going that into that you don't really get taught that in school. So they're kind of like you kind of go in thinking, okay, this is going to kind of be like a regular job, and then you come in, you find out it's not like that at all. So
Right.
that's a pretty big
Wow.
misconception I had.
A very big misconception, I would imagine. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's, I spent a little bit of my time in college. Like I said, I told you I majored in psychology. So for a little while, I wanted to work with adolescents in some way. That's what
Okay.
me and my best friends were kind of on that path to doing that. But I ended up switching and going my own direction. He ended up actually going in the mental health field. But um, I guess not a lot of people talk about, and I want your opinion on this, how important it is to find a specific therapist that you connect with well, because I feel like a big problem today is, somebody will go to therapy for a specific problem and they'll say, I didn't get along with therapists, I didn't like therapists, and then they just immediately drop therapy and stop. And
Yep.
now, now they have that problem, they have no way of
hmm
fixing it. So it's like, I guess dive deep into how important it is to really kind of like find somebody who gets you, because
Yeah.
they are people, a unique individual at the end of the day, also.
hmm
So,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it comes down to how you understand healing. Like, I mean, I think if you believe that healing comes from the relationship more so than necessarily
mhm.
whether or not the person is technically skilled or if they're even emotionally skilled, there's an understanding that the person that you work with, there's a relationship that you build. In every situation, whether it be individual, couples, groups, it doesn't really matter. There's a level of that relationship that is participating in healing. I always look at it as therapy is kind of like an opportunity, right? You should when the door closes, that's the opportunity for both people, but really it's ultimately the person who's coming in. And so as long as that door is closed, that's where we're here to focus on what you need in that moment. But to your point, I think that if you believe the relationship heals, then you have to find somebody who you feel comfortable with. And one of the things is that the mental health space is not totally designed for um, long-term care. I'll say it that way. A lot of these sessions, especially up until recently, since COVID, really, has there been more of these insurances that will allow people to come unlimitedly. For a long time, it used to only be they'd only be able to come for like 20 sessions or something. That was like a pretty good deal.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
When I
so the
was,
model,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
so I said the model is very set up to be very short term. So you're looking at it as like an intake, and then really from the intake, you're kind of dumping, you're kind of diving or you're driving right into everything you're working on. So with that, there's a lot of times I always tell people like now that we've had live and limited sessions, learn the person that you're working with. You probably won't know if they're a great fit for you, for potentially up to 7 to 10 sessions. Usually once you kind of hit that mark, then you kind of know, okay, I feel comfortable with this person or whatnot.
Oh, wow. I didn't
Some
realize it would
there
take that long. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, some therapists it might be sooner, some therapists it might not be. It just depends. I think there's a lot of therapists who also believe in the idea that, as long as the person's there and sharing, which there is some truth to that, like the fact that they're getting something out of it. And that is true to a degree, but as a therapist, you have to know when you need to make the shifts to be able to work on that rapport to some degree. So like the first couple sessions, you may give them a lot of tools. Here, try these things and see what works. Okay, great. We've established that. Okay, now the next period of sessions might be okay. Well, how do we take those things and make them work for you significantly? And then after that, then we kind of start going into maybe a higher stratosphere or deeper type of work.
Hmm.
But I think really that the client has to understand the process of, okay, like when I'm at, like, let's say it's session 7, for example. Okay, I feel like I've done some good things. I'm at kind of a point where I feel like I'm coming every other week or whatever the case is. Where do I need to then make that transition? The therapist has to also help with that as well. And I do think there is a little bit of like understanding that that's okay to question some of those things. You're not in a position where, as a therapist, I shouldn't be offended by any kind of things questions or learning from the client. Like the client's telling me it's their therapy. I'm there to help them, not them. It's all the ultimate goal. Even if it means I help them find somebody who's a better fit for them in that way. So there is a lot of different things that I think that have to come that are not necessarily expressly talked about at the very beginning because most people just don't, that's just not something that's in the model. So as a therapist, you kind of have to work toward identify, okay, here's what the major things we got to make sure we're talking about, and be open to that. As a client, like, are you open to the idea of finding somebody else? And if you don't have a great relationship with people in general, that can be challenging, certainly. And I can understand why people wouldn't want to come back if they've had a negative experience in therapy. And I've heard many of them of different ways of like, just feeling like they didn't get what they needed. But if I don't know what you need, then it's gonna be hard for me to be able to understand that. It's not gonna come
Yeah.
just naturally, by guessing. If I kind of need to have that two-way conversation there.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I've gone to therapy a little bit in my past. And I saw one guy for about 10 sessions, I think maybe. I don't even know if I ended up going the full 10 sessions. And then I saw another guy who I only went one session with and didn't really get along with, so I just kind of gave up on him. So it's good that you bring light to the fact that it takes a while, right, to really
Yeah.
gain and develop that connection. So I think that's pretty important to hear, honestly. Um, I guess next is so when somebody is working with a therapist, how, can somebody be can someone be mentally healthy while also still having, anxiety, depression, or grief, or like some major form of trauma going on?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you define healthy to a degree. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly, there's functional and then there's, sort of thriving, I guess would be another word I'd throw there. Um, this I think is where part of like the world of coaching is not explained very well in like the
Hmm.
world, right? So when people think of coaching, they typically think of coaching for like these kind of higher things, right? Business coaches or, whatever the case might be, or maybe you're focusing on something really specific or whatever. But really, coaching is kind of on the same spectrum as therapy. I mean, that's the ideal. The ideal design of it is that, if you have one side of it is kind of like doctors, that's where therapists would land. On the other side of it, you're gonna have like chiropractors, you're gonna have people who are physical therapists, those kind of things, people who are a little more, in tune with it, but not necessarily in tune in a diagnosing sense. They're more of like, ongoing care. That's kind of where coaching lands. Coaching is supposed to land on the other side of it. One of the things a therapist or I say therapist, the therapy in general does not do very well is that when there comes to be a certain point for a person that they're graduating therapy to get them in connected with somebody who's a coach for kind of ongoing support if they should need that. Certainly there's a point where you graduate therapy, maybe you're not doing anything at the time, you're just kind of moving forward. But coaching is really designed to kind of be like in the present. So the idea is that we're focusing on the here and now and kind of moving forward. Where therapy is more about diagnosing and kind of looking in the past. And so you have a little bit different perspective on that. Where versus coaching, you're not really necessarily you're not diagnosing anybody. You're kind of just walking with them and their sort of challenges that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Where like things with anxiety and those kind of things can be, I think, that's where it gets kind of hard to challenge because every client's a little bit different as far as like their intensity. So somebody who may have a higher anxiety, but they know how to manage it well, they know what they need to do in order to be able to lower it, to be able to function to the best of their ability, may not necessarily need to be in a therapeutic setting after they've kind of learned their tools, so to speak. On the other hand, if you have somebody who struggles with being able to function, then that might be somebody who's going to benefit from being either in a coaching or a therapeutic setting, simply because of the fact that they need that kind of support. So I do think that somebody can be healthy from a perspective of they are able to function, but they may not be able to thrive. And so there's a bit of that, and everybody looks a little different with those different terms. So I would say that there's no way to necessarily measure it and say like yeah, yes, this is healthy. Yes, this is not healthy. You really kind of have to look at it kind of individual basis and say, okay, well, what is this person's ideal space that they want to get to? Is that a realistic goal for them to be there? And if it is, can they reduce some of these things so they're not overwhelmed by them? I think specifically with anxiety and depression, is because they're common for everybody to experience. There's a level of that of okay, like we probably can maintain, but where does it become overwhelming for us? Where does it become, like I said, kind of non-functioning? And that can look a lot of different ways. If I'm not functioning and not going to school, or I'm not going to, whatever it is, work or whatever it is I'm doing that helps me to maintain my life, then obviously I'm at a point where I need to really seek some better services. If I'm in a position where I feel like, well, it happens from time to time, but it's not something that keeps me from doing my regular life, well, then I probably would say, like, let's start with a coach, start with somebody who can kind of help you with those small kind of tools, for day-to-day basis and kind of get you to a little more of a better functioning space there in that way.
Yeah. You're starting to talk about anxiety a little bit. Why do you think anxiety feels so common right now, if that makes sense in society?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, one is the conversation is there. I mean, a lot of people
Yeah.
are opening up about it. The other thing I think, and this is something that, we is collectively as a society, I've said this in our podcast too, is that we don't really know the effect of the internet, the phone, the devices from birth till death, meaning that we never had somebody who's gone a full life cycle with having a phone in their hand, so to speak. I've had people who've started, their life or whatever the case is, and they've ended, their life's ended in the digital age, so to speak. But to say I have a generation of people who, started out with a phone and they've ended with a phone, so to speak. That hasn't happened yet. So we really don't know the full effect of what that looks like. But if you look at when this sort of anxiety curvature is sort of, or elevation, I guess is a better way of saying it, has started it, you really got to go back to, certainly, I mean, like I graduated high school in 2007. I did have a cell phone, but it was one that was pretty much a dumb phone. It didn't really do a whole lot. It didn't have any connection to the internet or anything like that. The amount of how many things have elevated since we've been able to connect those devices to the internet and made the internet, basically the phone has become an intimate device. So the internet and all these things have become intimate to us because the phone goes places that people don't go. Phone goes to the bathroom, phone goes to the bedroom. Some people aren't even welcome to those spaces or don't even are privy to those spaces. So what it means is that the phone is an intimacy with us that is unlike any other device we have ever. And if you think about going back to like before that, the phone had a cord. It could only go so far. And so it had
Right.
a limitation to it. So I do think that anxiety really is amplified because of that intimacy with people. Now, whether or not that's because they are comparing themselves to other people, what else people are doing, if that's they're worried about things that are in the world that now have a much closer access to us than what it used to be. If you think about newspapers, you had to get a newspaper every morning, but the newspaper described something through words. It didn't describe things through a visual aid, which now has been given to that, right? So the news and all the things like that have given a visual aid to that. We didn't have social media, so there's an opportunity where people's opinions were relatively limited to what they could be shared. Now we've added that to, in some ways it's a positive, some ways it's a negative. We've added much more access to that. So I would say that I feel like the reason that anxiety is mostly amplified is because of those things that have brought proximity to us than they were before. And so I do think that, again, you could factor in COVID, you could factor a lot of things in there. Of course, you've had more time to think about some of those things. But it does seem like the amplification of that has all really come as the closer that those things have come to us, the more we've experienced anxiety. And so that's kind of my way I've thought about it in that sense.
Yeah, you made a great point saying that our phones are with us more than an actual human is ever with us because our phone is quite literally everywhere we go. And I never really had thought about it like that. So that definitely probably contributes heavily to those massive spikes in anxiety in society. It's so hard to understand it fully, like you said, because everybody's is different, right? Not one person experiences the same amount or same type in the
Yep.
same way that the next does. So it's just, I feel like it's very confusing almost in a way to kind of like not solve the problem because you can't really solve it, but just kind of like keep that in check, you know? And like I said, I've struggled with anxiety a lot just because I'm an athlete and, I feel like that's something I'm really passionate about is kind of like letting that light shine and how important it is in athletics, but it's
Oh
not really
yeah,
talked about much.
sure.
Um,
Well, the reason that a lot of that came for me was because going back to like the pornography, when I would work with the guys in the
right.
pornography, that it's the phone goes places that they wouldn't normally be able to access. It's like And I always tell people all the time, most basic rule is, the phone can't go to the bathroom, phone can't go to the bedroom, and period. If you cut out 50% of your opportunity to act out if you remove that. And so that's really where I kind of started this idea of like, thinking about that, like how much the device intimacy is replaced, other people and other things, and even to the idea of sports. I mean, like, like even being hyper focused because of that, like the phone gives you access to watch different things about relating to athletics on a regular basis. I mean, you can get, I'm a Lions fan, so Detroit Lions. So I tend to, if you look up anything, you can look up that whenever you're at. You could lay in bed, you could look up stuff about the Lions, and every moment you're have access to the phone. So that's really kind of where I've seen a lot of that amplify. Is I think it's got something to do with the device intimacy.
Okay. Yeah. How much of our mental health do you think is shaped by the relationships that we're in and the people that we're involved with?
Well, certainly, we've seen that from a perspective of the people, like how you feel about yourself and how you feel about your like direction going forward. They talk a lot about that on pretty much every level. Athletics, they talk about that in business a lot. Like if you don't put yourself or surround yourself with people who are kind of in the same, mindset, that your mindset's gonna be affected. And I think there's a couple of reasons to that. Number one, I'd say because, we tend to sort of reflect off the people that we are closest to, and we do tend to fall into a lot of those kind of patterns, positively or negatively. But the other thing as well is that, when we have an idea that's presented to us over and over and over again, we tend to sort of fall in line with that, even if we don't necessarily totally always agree with it. So the example I give there is if, you might do something a specific way in business, or you might do a specific way, like using, athletics. If you might have a certain swing that you have as a baseball player. And we see this with other things, right? If you get traded to a different team, all of a sudden you change your swing. All of a sudden you're a totally different person than you were when you played for the first team. So, and you say that with business too, like you make some tweaks or make some changes, all of a sudden things start to kind of come together. So I do think there is an aspect of our like long-term future, what do we want to get to? It's important to put yourself around people who think that way. Now, from the past, where I always tell people, and I see this with couples all the time, is whatever you're working with, if it's healthy or unhealthy, if you have seen a pattern that you don't like or the pattern that you do like, that's probably your norm you're working from. Meaning that whatever you saw with mom and dad, whatever you saw with other relationships around you, that's kind of what your norm's going to be. And it's really easy to fall back into that. So you have to identify that as being, okay, this is where I don't want to be. So how am I going to change it? But I have to work from that sort of perspective, because I think a lot of people feel like, well, that's kind of what I know. It doesn't, if I don't like it, I'm not going to go back to it. I don't necessarily know that that's entirely accurate. Sometimes we might not like it, but that's what we know. And our brains are very like oriented to like doing the same thing over and over again. And so even if we say it's unhealthy, it's a lot easier for us to jump back into that. You see that with like dieting too. People like, hey, I want to change my diet. So why is it so hard for me to eat a salad versus eating something that,
Right.
chocolate, for example. And so that's kind of the same kind of deals. We have these pathways and these freeways in our brain that are, the more we do things, the wider they are, the more easier they're to access, versus things that are harder for us to do, the more intentional they are much more narrow, and they're much more overgrown. So we have to, the things we have to continue to practice are the things that are going to make those pathways or those freeways in our brain wider. And so that's something that you have to, I think every time we might make a change, that's one of the things we are always up against to some degree.
Yeah. I'm going to pivot here a little bit. I know that you are deep in faith as a Christian as well. Correct. How do
Yeah.
you see faith and mental health working together?
Yeah, theology asks a lot of the same questions that psychology does. Psychology can't overtake your faith. It can't be something where you're going to say, well, psychology says this, so therefore I need to, be aligned with psychology over my theology. But I think that if you look at it from the perspective, a lot of the sciences, or if they're hard or soft sciences, are really designed about, theology offers its own explanation of why the earth is and the world is the way that it is. And I do think that if you're a theology first and then science second person, you always are going to defer back to your theology first, because your theology gives you the sort of guidance and the guideposts, whereas the science sort of fills in the gaps, so to speak. It helps you to understand other parts of things that maybe you hadn't considered. And theology usually aligns pretty well with most of the sciences anyway. There are things in psychology, obviously, that are kind of, a little bit further out than maybe some of the things with like biological science that we know about. But I do think that they do have a place where they work hand in hand. We can't be afraid of psychology, but we also can't be afraid of not allowing theology to have a place in which it influences psychology in that way. So I guess I would say that, for me, I always look at it like I don't put a lot of theology on the clients I work with unless they want that. Unless somebody says, "Hey, I really want to work with this area and I have questions about my faith and we can talk about those kind of things." Most of the time I look at it as let's work on the things that, even if you want to work on the psychology part of it, then maybe you're in a space more to talk about the theology. But I usually typically don't start with the theology first in that way, simply because for me, the theology orients me. It doesn't orient them necessarily. If they may be in a position where they're a different, different part of what their belief system is, or maybe where they're in their growth with the Lord. So I always look at it as, like that helps ground me, that's my perspective first and then my psychology part second, simply because the fact that, like I said, the theology always kind of is going to be your space that you're starting from. And I do think that psychology does give some ideas where, like we know that, the Bible talks about this idea of, there's many parts of the Bible talks about this idea of like, setting your mind on the Lord, setting your mind on peace, understanding that, when you have a deep faith and you're deeply rooted in your relationship with the Lord, it will bring peace. It will bring connection with Him. It will bring purpose. It will bring a lot of these things that people have a lot of anxiety around. And so that's just kind of a mirror of that, right? Like our psychology is often mirrored from the theology that people will, in that sense, if you're missing some things in your life, theology does offer that type of, foundation. In a lot of ways, in psychology, you may not even be able to do that, right? If just because you can control symptoms doesn't necessarily mean that it gives you purpose or that it gives you direction and some of those kind of things. So I do think they work hand in hand, and they always have, at least in a lot of the training I've had, where those come together. But as far as being a practical application of it, one of the things, like I said, it really depends on the people you're working with. If you have people who are deeply rooted in faith, then I would definitely say you can bring that into the sessions. But if you're working for kind of a generic, outpatient type of thing, like I usually have worked in most of my career, you really orient for yourself and you allow that to be an extension of what you work with people.
Before we get back to the episode, I want to shout out one of our sponsors, Hydrate Heroes. Hydrate Heroes makes plant-based hydration products with clean electrolytes, zero sugar, only 5 calories, and no artificial junk or dyes. They are an equilibrium brand that uses functional mushrooms to support hydration, energy, focus, calm, general wellness, all in a cleaner formula that you can feel good about. So if you want to go try them out, go to hydrateheroes.com. I'll have links in the description and use code HERO20. That's code HERO20 for 20% off your first 6 stick sample pack. So again, that's hydrateheroes.com, code HERO20. Big thank you to Hydrate Heroes for supporting the podcast. Let's get back to the episode. Okay. Do you think that people sometimes spiritualize issues that also need emotional or like a clinical attention? That makes sense.
Yeah, there certainly is some element of that, right? Like, if you have, like, so we use anxiety since we've been talking about that. If you have anxiety, you need to pray more, or if you need anxiety, you need to engage more with your faith and those kind of things. And there are probably some elements where that it can be somewhat true. But I'd also go on the other side of it and say, like, if we are anxious about things, and back to my example about the intimacy with the devices, what are we doing to reduce some of those symptoms from a perspective of our own practices? And sometimes faith can be part of those things that help us have a better and more centered idea of practices that we have every day. But I would also say and argue on the other side of it that if we've trained ourselves to be somewhat anxious, or maybe we've been around an anxious home, or maybe there's other reasons why we might have higher anxiety, we need to identify those things and be able to kind of combat them on the other end of that, which would be utilizing the things that, are part of our body. So, grounding and all the different things that help activate the vagus nerve, which are part of our fight or flight response. So I do think there's a place where some of those things do get spiritualized because you look at it as it's spiritual warfare. I think there's some truth to that as well. Certainly, there's an element of that. So it's not just one thing or another. It's probably a combination of a lot of those things, and you have to kind of bring all of those into play. So, like for example, if you're a Christian and you're struggling with anxiety, where is your faith life to that degree? Where do you feel like some of those things are, and kind of examine that first and then go to the psychology part of it. Okay, so where am I? I've kind of taken care of this other part. I feel like my relationship with the Lord's been really good. I'm praying more often. I'm finding purpose and finding, peace in the spirit, but I'm still having some of these anxieties. Maybe I need to look at what else might be going on that is a physical thing that is closer to me than maybe necessarily than I think it is. And again, devices can be part of that, but also, just the general aspect of what I'm eating or what I'm focusing on through the day, or maybe how I navigate my, stress or overwhelmed with work and those kind of things. Like there's a lot of different components to that. And even to the point of view, like as you said, an athlete, like where am I, what am I prioritizing in that way? Am I prioritizing some of these other things to help me kind of keep myself in the right space so that I'm not, putting the priorities in the wrong place and creating more anxiety that way?
Right. Right. As a collective, in the go build a big picture here, do you think that we're becoming more mentally healthy as a society, or just more conscious and more aware of mental health in general?
That's the first word I thought of as soon as you said. I said I feel like we're more mentally aware, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're more mentally healthy.
Yeah.
Awareness is not healthiness necessarily. Awareness is bringing it to awareness, like we said, but it also can be identity. And I think that there is a place where my mental awareness becomes my mental identity, rather, or my existence of my identity, rather than necessarily trying to overcome that. And I can see some level of where people are understanding some of that. I'm not saying that it's completely unrealistic to say that, but I think you can't necessarily camp there. That can't become your permanent residence. You have to really understand that you're eventually going to pick up stakes and we're going to move to somewhere else there. And I think there's seasons in that. So sometimes there might be a season where, yes, certainly awareness can bring a season of growth, but does that mean that that's the season I'm just going to say because I kind of can understand more, I can pathologize things or whatever. Specifically to anxiety, I think, if we're all anxious and we believe that we all can have anxiety because part of being human, why would we want to camp in that particular space or stay in that season? That season doesn't eventually get me anywhere of growth because anxiety is keeping me probably from more things that I could do, right? Because it holds me back to a degree. So why do I want to identify as something that keeps me, sort of shackled to it? I used to use the same terminology with pornography too. Like, if I don't, I might really have a strong desire to stop pornography use, but if I don't do the things that are going to help me to practice to be outside of my desire for pornography, then I'm probably going to stay shackled to it. Meaning that
Yeah.
I'm going to have a chain that's going to let me how, and again, I keep letting out the line as long as I want to go. And some people do. Some people let their line out really long, but it always comes pulling them back. And so what is that thing that keeps pulling you back to it? Well, it's part of it, in my opinion, is that you haven't fully committed to the idea that you don't want to be shackled to this thing. There's a part of it that brings comfort. We talked about that earlier, and the idea that what's our norm, and something like that is that behavior certainly can be very normalized. It doesn't necessarily mean that we like it, but it means that it is something that can be very normalized.
Yeah. And you touched a lot on social media and how important that is, right? Creating that awareness. Um, has that created, would you say it's created more awareness or just complicated it further? I mean, you kind of gave a little bit of opinion on that, but I mean, it can do good for,
Sure.
it can.
If I was to make a hard line in the sand, I suppose, because it seems like that's where you're going, is that it's a hard line in the sand on it is
Well, yeah.
has anxiety improved our society or has awareness improved our society or made it worse? I think in a lot of cases it probably has made it more it's just made it more opinionated and more murky. And so because it's more murky to really say that it's something that really has brought a lot of healing for people. I think there certainly has been people who've been prompted to heal, and there's lots of stories of people that I've heard, whether people that I've worked with before, people that I've talked to, or just whatever, that have their healing does exist for people. I want to be very clear on that. I think that that's a big part of being in mental health is about the belief that there is healing. However, healing is also not necessarily healing from a perspective of becoming whatever we feel like we're identifying with in that way. So like becoming our anxiety, or like I've kind of said before, like becoming what those symptoms are, understanding those are symptoms, they're not identity. And I know I've so to the idea of identity is that what does make us who we are. And theology is part of that, but certainly the fact is that there's also a lot of things that we do, positive and negative, that do make us who we are. And so we have to acknowledge both sides of those things. I think if people pathologize just their feelings, meaning they just say, "Okay, I'm just an anxious person," they leave too much room for that experience to just be where they stop. And like I said, where they camp out, and that becomes the season in which the season doesn't end. You don't get a chance to move forward there, and that's unfortunate for them, but it's also unfortunate for the people around them because, as the example of the person who's healing, how do I demonstrate that healing to other people? Well, I don't if I just say that, hey, this is where I'm going to camp out and this is where I'm going to be, permanently. I sort of just kind of admit defeat there. And again, I think there's a difference between defeating and sort of knowing that it could be a long-term healing process. Healing doesn't always mean it's not going to hurt. And healing doesn't always necessarily mean it's not going to be challenging or difficult. If you hurt, using the athletic example, you break your leg, you got to, or tear your ACL or MCL or something like that. It's going to be a long process to get back, but eventually you will be able to get back. Maybe not as strong as you were before you got that wound, but what did you learn in order so that you can now take care of yourself in a better way?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So I was just saying that, when you hurt, you're hurt, as an athlete, whether you tear your ACL or MCL or what some part of your leg muscles, it's a long journey back, but you learn a lot about, a lot of the guys will always talk about, they learned, about discipline, or they learned how to be able to be different, or how to help, how to, be more healing, and how to slow down, those kind of things. So I do think that there is some wounds, or there's some, that was, there's some, there's a lot of benefit from those types of healing in that way. And I think that's where we're missing some of those things with awareness. We are aware of ACL tears, but are we, rather than saying, hey, like I can overcome an ACL tear, I just kind of identify as, nope, I'm somebody who has a torn ACL now. I'll never be able to play the way I used to play. And we kind of just stay there, rather than necessarily saying, okay, you know what, it's something I can overcome, and I can overcome that through this process, and I will get there. I think that's the one thing on mental health that is a little bit of the challenge right now with the way it is that awareness is there, and that's great. And there's a lot of awareness to lots of different aspects of mental health. But until we have an honest conversation about healing in that way, that healing is not linear, and it's not necessarily something that is going to result in um, a brand new identity as much as it's going to help you become the identities beyond the healing, so to speak. I think that's the thing that people really need to, or that's where therapy is going to always sort of come short a little bit for people. Because I think there's back to your very, very first original question, you said, what's the one thing that people um, don't understand about therapy? I think it's that healing is awareness, not necessarily um, overcoming, maybe is a better
Okay.
word.
I've got two things I want to say in one question here. First thing, I guess, is kind of like, what do you think the difference is between coping with something and healing? And then, um, I guess to go along with that, do you think that the feeling that people have, I guess they attach themselves right to their pain because it feels familiar and it's just kind of all what they know.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? I mean, I feel like because I speaking from kind of personal experience in a way as well, but I'm just curious to see what your kind of take on all that is.
Well, I do see that with chaos for sure. If
Yeah.
you know chaos, then it's really hard to not have chaos, because the opposite of chaos is peace, and peace is very uncomfortable if I'm used to chaos. Me personally, I'm on the other side of it, so chaos is uncomfortable for me, so I try to avoid that. But it is part of life, so I have to kind of navigate as best I can. But as far as what do you say, cope between the difference between coping and healing, I think coping, if I were to use coping in the sense that is skill sets designed to navigate the daily things that happen in life. Means that I have challenges that are going to be over, so they're almost future oriented in that way. So like I know that I'm going to have stress and overcoming things at work because work is a stressful job. Okay, I have coping skills to navigate that. I know when I feel sad or feel anxious or I feel overwhelmed or whatever, I know I have these skills to overcome that in the here and now or in the future. To me, healing is more past oriented, meaning that I have a wound or something that happened in the past that I'm learning to adapt or accept, or become skilled to be able to navigate that when those show up in the here and now, because they may. But certainly the healing piece is being able to understand that whatever happened in my past is part of what I, who may is part of my foundation for me moving forward in the future. Whereas coping is more focus oriented in the future, that this is overcoming those things. So I think it's
Okay.
another way of thinking about that could be, I'm learning the skill sets to be able to play a sport, um, but I am naturally a gifted athlete, right? So there's an aspect where I have a natural element of things I have to like learn about myself, so I can be able to then apply the things that they're teaching me to then be a better athlete. So that's kind of the way I would almost take that kind of analogy in those two pieces.
Okay. Okay. I gotcha. Yeah. I was just curious just because it's such a, I mean, nobody, they'll say they're coping with something, but then it's not really actually them healing. It's just them.
Right.
basically finding a way to get by every single day, but not making any positive progression to feeling
Yes.
better.
Yeah,
So,
plateauing.
right, right. Do you, I mean, I guess if we're talking just kind of like your standard for what a healthy life would look like, what does that look like in terms of somebody that, deals with anxiety or depression or something like that? What kind
No.
of what does that look like to you getting through that?
Well, I think I use the one word, and I think it's resilience.
Yeah.
It's resilience to being able to overcome whatever is going to happen that, and we don't know those things. Um, Positive, negative, or otherwise, sort of if I'm resilient, I can take the good things, and learn and be humble about them, meaning I can still accept those good things. I don't have to reject them or say I don't deserve them or whatever else, which is a lot of times what people will do. And on the bad, the things that are negative, so to speak, or things that are harder, learn that those are challenges that are going to help me become stronger and become a better, to continue to grow as a person, and that I can't escape either of those things. Sometimes it feels like people want to live in a neutral space, means that everything is good, everything's kind of happy, everything's, whatever that is. Like people talk about all the time, I'm pursuing happiness. Happiness is a fleeting emotion. If you're pursuing anything, you're pursuing contentedness, because
Yeah.
ultimately contentedness is far more resilient than necessarily pursuing happiness. Happiness is a just emotion, just like anything else, just like anger, just like sadness. We talked about pathologized words. Anger is a pathologized word in that way because people will only path put as a path basically for I am an angry person. Well, that's just an identity again. It's not necessarily an emotion, and it is an emotion. Anger is an emotion. It's not an identity, and people often will identify that. So that's I think so to your point, what is the word that defines a healthy life is really resilience, because resilience is going to teach you to take the positive and the negative and still be able to grow from both of those things, and not reject either of them.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a fascinating thing to talk about, honestly. I mean, I think you kind of talked about it a little bit, but what's kind of one piece of advice that you would give to somebody, or I guess to anybody and everybody that needs to hear it, one piece of mental health advice that you would give. Most important, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do think that every opportunity or every breath is a second chance, so to speak, and everybody has an opportunity to do something different, myself included, that to do something to the next degree, the next step, the next breath to make a different decision. Um, there's always that I've seen many memes online over the years for, making inaction is a decision, which is true. I mean, it's hard to necessarily, for me anyway, it's hard to necessarily not feel like there's a part where I could just plateau. I think we all feel like we can get to a point where we can kind of normalize or stabilize, but we are either growing or getting worse. It's just the sort of facts of the way it is. Now, in the grand scheme of our life, maybe we're only going down a little bit or we're going up a little bit, but the reality is we're doing one way or the other. And so I think every breath is an opportunity for us to do a different decision toward what we want to be. Some of those things are things we need to be. You talked about also back to faith. There's certainly an element of who God wants us to be as people. So
Hmm.
we need to really focus first and foremost on who He wants us to be, and then how do we get there and to be the person that is in that space. So um, I think everyone has that same opportunity every day, whether or not we feel it or we don't. And I think accepting that is a big part of the maturity process of saying, okay, you know what, I know that I am not going to be perfect, but I know that I can, live in excellence, basically. Live in a place where I don't have to be perfect or failure. I can be in the space of the progression of going toward that race and running the race, um, better than I did this last breath, or better than I did yesterday, or better than I did a year ago, or better than I did
Hmm.
10 years ago.
Hmm. Yeah. Out of all the people that you've helped with your coaching, what gives you hope about the future of mental health in human beings that you would say?
Well, there's a strong interest in what I do. It hasn't necessarily translated into too many people that I've directly worked with, but a lot of people I do get a lot of feedback on that this is an important area in the coaching space to talk about mental health owners, and it's as far as mental health practices go. I can't change the whole system of being a mental health practice, but I can help people individually become the best owners they can be, so that they can be able to provide a great home for other therapists. Because I think that one of the reasons that the field is inconsistent that it is because a lot of therapists don't feel comfortable working with other therapists or their owners, et cetera. And you're taught kind of in school that you learn your way and learn your way best, and it just pour into that way. But one of the things I found is that really makes it splinters the field. You have a bunch of people who just do it their own way and they don't learn how to be able to interact and learn how to have strength with other therapists. And so I think if you have really good cultures in your practices, that will translate into greater mental health for the population ultimately, because it will, if it's strong therapists, they're going to do great work with the people that they work with. If you're a therapist who's splintered, you're going to not want to come to work, and you're going to struggle with necessarily coming
Yeah.
and being around people that are your peers. So to me, it's really important that we work on that area simply because in all my experiences, I mean, I've worked for some different places and there's been some pros and there's also been a lot of cons. And so in those spaces, I would love to see mental health practices just become as an entity stronger because I do think it in total raises the field and raises the ability for people to get help. And so I do think that gives me hope that there's people who really feel like that's an important space. Now, whether or not they're going to be willing to step in and do something about that, that's a different issue. But certainly the idea that oh, again, awareness, they have awareness of that being a concern. And, now what do we do with that?
And you touched briefly on it too, but I mean, it's such a challenge for a lot of people to step outside of their comfort zone and just be vulnerable enough to accept that they do need to go to therapy and they do need healing in that
Absolutely.
sense. I mean, how can somebody that is struggling to get over that hump of just going, how can somebody get over that and feel the courage and to say I need therapy and I'm not embarrassed to say it?
Mhm. Well, I definitely think encouraging people to think about doing their work, doing some research. Psychology Today is a great resource to find therapists who are, certainly, might be like-minded or might be people that you're looking for, whether they be, whatever they may believe in or what kind of people they serve, what kind of symptoms you're struggling with, et cetera. I think that's a big thing. So do some research, understand that the person is not there to put you down or put you in a bad space. They're there really to listen and be a resource. And if you don't feel that that's what they're there to do, then find somebody who you feel is going to be able to support you in that way. Obviously, one of the things that I usually hear people don't like, they feel like they're being vulnerable and sharing all of their stuff, and that's a scary thing. And 100% that's a scary thing. And that is one of the things that there's nothing that I can do or say that's going to make a person not have that fear because I can get that fear a lot. But understand that, going to therapy in that way is not to be condemned as much as it's there to be able to help you to look at, take all of your things in your box, so to speak, and sort of spill them out. And how do we rearrange these in a different way, if you want to use kind of that analogy. Therapy is more designed to help you see things in a new way or help you to have connection in a different way or to see how a relationship could be different with somebody else than maybe what you've experienced before. And so part of it is understanding that, that there's going to be a natural sense of fear, but also understanding that it may not be the worst case scenario. Your worst case scenario is probably not going to come true in therapy. And if it does, it doesn't mean that that's how every situation is going to be like that. But I can understand people's hesitation to that for sure. And as a therapist, after you do it for a while, it gets harder to necessarily have that same. I mean, you have to be empathetic to that because for us, it feels like it's we know what the process looks like and all those kind of things, and it's sometimes hard to necessarily be able to verbalize that to other people who haven't gone through it. So I can understand people's hesitation that way.
Yeah. And I can completely agree with that as well because I went through that exact same kind of fear, worst case
Hmm.
scenario type of fear. Don't want to open up. I have too much pride. That's how I always grew up was as an athlete. It was just having so much pride in myself and wanting to be and come off as being like the strongest and most
Yeah.
secure as I possibly could. But when I finally let that guard down and just trusted that this is what I needed to feel, more at ease about myself, I instantly felt like knew it was the right decision. So yeah,
I'm
it's
glad to
such
hear
an
that.
important thing. Such an important thing for those that are, I guess, struggling to find the courage to go see somebody. So Last thing I'll ask you, man, and I guess this is a something I've kind of held towards the end, but I mean, in your opinion, gosh, I guess what gives you, I mean, I already asked that something kind of similar to this, but like what does give you hope about people and that ability to heal from what you've seen?
Well, there's a lot of different, I don't know if I'd say like exact examples of psychology that have proven where people can become resilient or whatnot, but there's this thing called the hero's journey. And basically, everyone goes through a serious process of different things, right? We have a calling to some degree in on our lives, and whether that's theological or it's of some kind of passion we have or whatever, right? And we have these things that we could draw us into being, having purpose to live and purpose to be part of our existence and sharing that with other people. And I do think that in my opinion, the facts are that we're all here for some reason, right? We're all here to do something. We were created with intent. And again, maybe
Mm.
that's more theological than what people would like to hear. But the reality is that if you believe in that idea, then there's some reason why you're here, even if you don't think it's from that perspective. And so what can you do with that? I mean, you have two choices. I mean, you can either live for you or you can live for trying to make the world a better place. And I think that your pain is unique to you and your pain is unique to your experience. And so because of that, that's a story that's worth sharing. That's a story that somebody else may have had something similar, or somebody else could relate to, or maybe somebody doesn't know a lot about. We don't ask a lot of questions as in our society, kind of back to the awareness piece. Like we raise awareness, but we don't necessarily ask questions of why that person had that experience. And so for me, I think that, the biggest thing we could ask for as far in the journey of being in life is that how do we understand other people's experiences in context that can help me grow as a person so that I can pass that to somebody else. Because somewhere
Share your
along the way
testimony.
that wisdom's going to mean something, right? If it's testimony theologically or if it's testimony from the perspective of what my experience has been, or even what something I struggled with, I think those are all valuable pieces of information. And I think one of the things that, for a long time in society, we've had this idea like hold those stories in. Don't share those stories. Don't tell people what that's like, because other people aren't going to accept that. And I think that's the one change that we've made, in a positive sense of raising awareness has been that people are more willing to share their stories. But in the same idea, I would say that does that story help bring more resilience, or does that story help bring more self-glory in some ways, or self-criticism in some ways, or maybe people see us in a light that, we think is going to make people be focused on us in that way. So I think that's one of the things we have a choice to make it different than that. And so, but does that become my choice? And that's something I would choose daily. Who do you choose? Do you choose to be able to give back to people, or do you choose to sort of, keep it to yourself? And again, you have the right to choose, make either decision. But what is the best decision for, as a collective? What is the best decision that you feel is that purpose? What is going to fulfill your purpose in that way of doing those things? Is it better to serve to give more people? I would argue yes, but then again, that's my perspective. So somebody
Right.
else might say it's better just to hold it into. But there's a lot of healing in sharing and healing in helping other people know what it's like to be your experience, and be what you went through as an individual. And I'm saying that to Braxton as much as I'm saying it to all the people that
There it
are
is.
that are listening. So.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing your insight today. I really appreciate it.